Hello everyone, Dr. Yonit Arthur here, audiologist and strength coach. You are on the Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about visual disturbances that occur with chronic dizziness symptoms. And if you've been on my channel for a while, you may have already seen my previous video on this topic, but this is going to be completely different. In that previous video, I explained a lot about the mechanisms behind visual disturbances, and I gave you some exercises that are typically used as part of vestibular rehabilitation therapy to help people who are experiencing dizziness symptoms. However, in general, when I work with people with chronic dizziness symptoms, that is, people who've had symptoms for a while and whose symptoms are not explained by some kind of medical problem, I actually rarely give them exercises. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why these visual disturbances happen. I'm going to give you some examples of the types of things that I hear from clients, and then I'm going to tell you how I actually work with clients who are experiencing chronic dizziness symptoms and visual disturbances to help them overcome them. So let's first define what I mean by visual disturbances. People who have chronic dizziness symptoms very frequently report visual issues. And generally, these complaints fall into a few different categories. Some people report difficulty with complex visual stimuli, which means basically that when you look at things that are visually busy, like carpets, like supermarket aisles, your eyes really can't seem to catch up with what you're seeing, and it makes you feel really off. The second category of visual disturbances is difficulty when the perspective that you're seeing is visually confusing. So some of you may have difficulty in really large spaces, especially when the walls and the ceiling are similar colors or when the ceilings are really, really high. And some of you may have trouble in small spaces. In other words, these difficulties occur when what your eyes are seeing are ambiguous. Normally, we use all of our senses to make sense of the world around us, and when your brain is over-relying on vision, also known as visual dominance, which we'll talk about more in a moment, what people experience is that their brains can't make sense of really large spaces or really small spaces or spaces that contain information that can't be purely interpreted by the eyes. Examples of this might include the fridge or like closets, or really large spaces like malls or exercise studios, especially when the walls are white and it's really not clear where the wall corners end and begin. The third category of visual disturbances that I often hear about is when people feel like they're having difficulty focusing their eyes when their heads are moving or when objects are moving. And this has to do with the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which is a reflex that connects your vestibular system inside your inner ears to your eyes and helps stabilize your eyes as your head moves. Also included in category 3 are people who feel like there's a delay between their vision and their brain, like their brain is trying to catch up with what their eyes are seeing. For example, the person will turn his or her head or move his or her eyes to look at an object, and it seems like it takes a moment for the brain to catch up and know what you're looking at. This second type from category 3 may have something to do with the VOR, but I know that many of you have had your vestibular systems assessed very thoroughly and nothing wrong has been found with your vision or with your vestibular system, in which case this delay is what I would term a central problem. It's a processing problem, a problem that's coming from your brain. And we'll talk more about what I mean by that in a little bit. Beyond the 3 that I just talked about, a large subset of you also has visual sensitivity to things like screens and visual sensitivity to things like bright lights. And I talk about lights in a different video that I will link to in the video description below, but we're going to be talking about screens a lot today, so keep listening. So when is VRT, or vestibular rehabilitation, appropriate for visual issues like the ones we just talked about? Well, it's appropriate if you have a physical injury, disease, or some other kind of physical medical explanation for your symptoms. It's also appropriate if you don't have a medical explanation for your symptoms and you have not been through vestibular rehabilitation therapy before, and visual rehabilitation therapy type exercises make your symptoms worse. So if you look at the first video I did on visual disturbances, if you do those exercises and they don't bring on any symptoms, then vestibular rehabilitation therapy is not likely going to be beneficial for you in resolving the issues you're having. So when is vestibular rehabilitation therapy not appropriate? When you've already been through VRT and it hasn't helped you. When you've had chronic dizziness symptoms that have lasted for a long time, there's no medical explanations, and some stubborn symptoms persist no matter what you're doing. If these apply to you, then the rest of this video is how I would help you if you were my client. So why do visual disturbances happen so often for people with dizziness? Your brain relies on three primary sensory systems to help you balance: your eyes, your inner ears, and your sense of touch. And when there's any kind of disturbance to the balance of the system, the brain tends to over-rely on the eyes. That's what vision dominance is. It's extremely common in people with any kind of vestibular disorder, but it's equally common in people who have chronic medically unexplained symptoms, because your brain also tends to be visually dominant when it believes that you are in danger. You might notice when you're stressed out that your senses tend to sharpen, but particularly your vision. So visual dominance can be a double whammy for some of you. Anyone who already has a vestibular issue or dizziness is going to be more prone to overusing the eyes, or the brain, more accurately, is going to be used to overemphasizing the information coming in from your eyes. And people who are dealing with a lot of fight or flight or danger mode are also going to be overemphasizing the eyes and not paying as much attention to the information coming in from the ears and sense of touch. And I want to make a little note here on some of the functional visual problems that some people are posting about in my YouTube comments, like binocular vision dysfunction and convergence disorders. Now, there are true convergence disorders that require medical treatment or supervised therapy, but these kinds of functional vision disorders usually don't indicate that there's any structural problem in your eye, and they are actually very common across the entire population. Most people who have these kinds of functional visual issues are not suffering from dizziness symptoms. So if your dizziness and your visual problem started at the same time, it's likely that your vision didn't cause your dizziness. The visual disturbances are accompanying the dizziness and are not being caused by an innocuous or non-dangerous functional vision disorder. I wanted to say this because I've seen many people go down the vision therapy rabbit hole, and in my experience, which of course again is biased because I see people with dizziness specifically, and doing lots of vision therapy did not resolve the dizziness. The visual disturbances were a side effect of the dizziness, and the functional vision issues that the person had were not really causing the symptoms. So what would I do if you were my client and you came into my office and said, I'm having all these visual disturbances, my chronic dizziness is medically unexplained, I've already been through vestibular rehab, I've already tried the exercises, I still can't function on screens, or I can't function in large spaces, or I can't look at busy carpets, what would I do? The very first thing I would do is explain that what you're dealing with is a central processing problem. In other words, It's a software problem in your brain. It's not being caused by a hardware problem. There's nothing physically wrong with your brain or your eyes that's causing the issue. It's that your brain is not properly using the visual information that it's getting to interpret your surroundings. And as you might have seen elsewhere on my channel, my approach to this is helping people understand that the predictive coding in your brain, so in other words, how well your brain interprets sensory information, also known as the software program it's using to interpret visual information, is deeply affected by your psychosocial context. In other words, your ability to function well in these visually difficult situations depends on your brain knowing that those situations are safe. When danger mode is active in your brain, when you're under stress, when you've been dealing with a lot of conflicts, when you have had other factors earlier in your life that have led your nervous system to be hypersensitive, it can make mistakes. And when it makes mistakes and thinks that things are dangerous when they're not, your brain doesn't process sensory information accurately. In other words, if your brain is predicting that screens, that large spaces, that small spaces, that carpet patterns are dangerous, you are going to respond to those situations with dizziness. Your brain is going to incorrectly interpret those situations as dangerous and bring on symptoms. Now, why is this so important? Because every treatment that you've tried in the past, for example, vestibular rehab or vision therapy or medical treatments, have all been making the assumption that the root cause of the problem is this brain software problem. But what I'm saying is there's a reason that your brain is running the wrong program. And the reason, to sum it up, is stress and an overactive stress response in your central nervous system. So after educating you on this, what would I suggest as some ways to mitigate this response? Now, because I take the position that the real root problem here is an overactive nervous system response and not actually the program itself, I'm not interested in just reprogramming this circuit. That's why I'm not going to give you a bunch of exercises. Your brain is perfectly capable of not being dizzy. There's something standing in the way of that program being eliminated by your daily activities. There's a misconception that neuroplasticity, or your brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience, is something that you have to do deliberately. And yes, of course, there's work that needs to go into changing your software program, but your brain is constantly adapting to your environment. If there were nothing holding your brain back from rewiring around these vision issues, then vestibular rehab, vision therapy, and just exposure to your daily life would resolve the problem. Again, all this assuming that there's no underlying medical cause. So that being said, these are the three components I would be addressing in my work with you. The first is fear. The more fear that you have of your symptoms, the more avoidance that you have surrounding things related to your symptoms, the more you are accidentally sending your brain continued messages of danger. And when you're sending your brain messages of danger, your brain is going to keep that same program running. It might look like this. You're about to go into the mall, and then you remember every other time you've gone into the mall and felt terrible. Your brain is gonna say, okay, great, we know what's gonna happen. Activate the feeling terrible in the mall program. I know that sounds overly simplistic, and of course that anecdote is, but this is truly how your brain works. Your brain works using predictions. It doesn't just respond to things in your environment, it has templates that it uses for each situation to help make sure that you're ready to respond right away. If every time you encountered a situation, your brain had to figure it out from the bottom up, that would be very inefficient. So your fear, anticipation, and avoidance of situations that bring on your symptoms is a major player in why the symptoms keep going. So the first thing we would be doing is trying to get you to do those things more often while also trying to change the fear response by giving yourself messages of safety. It can be as simple as saying to yourself, I'm safe, this is a brain error, there's nothing wrong with me. It can be taking a few deep breaths. It can be reassuring yourself. It can be asking someone to put a hand on your shoulder for support. There are many ways to send yourself a message of safety instead of a message of fear. The second thing we would be working on is attention. The more attention you give something, the more your brain understands that it needs to focus on it. So the more someone obsesses about visual symptoms, the more someone focuses on visual symptoms and trying to get rid of them, the more that backfires. And again, I know why you're here, and you're here to get rid of your visual symptoms. So it makes complete sense that you'd be focused on doing that. But you want to be smart about how you do it. You can allot a certain amount of time to the activities I'm talking about here, and then try to spend the rest of your waking hours doing something other than that. And preferably not doing it in an avoidant way, but rather in a way that involves you doing things that you enjoy, being distracted by activities that you love, rather than trying to grit your teeth and not think of something, which never works, right? The third thing we'd be working on is stress, and this is a big category. So stress doesn't just mean stressful life events like trouble at work or trouble at school. Stress also means emotional conflict. It means unresolved interpersonal issues that are still affecting you. It may even mean situations from long ago that made your nervous system learn that it had to be on high alert all the time. And if this sounds like a really complicated thing, it can be. But here are some ways that you can start to parse out what stress, what emotions, what other factors might be affecting you for particular sets of symptoms. The first suggestion I have for you is to look for inconsistencies. When I hear from people who have visual issues, sometimes they truly have them in response to everything. And I get that. This might not work for you if that's the case. But for most people, certain situations bother them, certain ones don't. Sometimes even certain screens bother them and other ones don't. Or they only get dizzy when they're on the work computer, but not when they're on the home computer. Or they're only bothered by carpets or patterns near a parent's house or a friend's house, but not in their own house. So you want to look for these inconsistencies because that tells you where your brain might be perceiving danger and what that danger could be. See if you can catch yourself during one of those times to see what's going on in your head, what's going on in your body, what are you thinking, what are you feeling, what is bothering you. The second thing to look for that can be a little bit more subtle is look for avoidance. When you find yourself symptomatic, ask yourself, is there something else I'm trying to avoid right now? And an example of this might be someone who says, yeah, every time I watch TV, I have symptoms. When we break it down, it turns out that that person is only watching TV either at the end of a very long, stressful day or to avoid other tasks. That person's not taking time to work through the stress and the emotions of the day. There are some other things the person is avoiding doing, and so that internalized stress is still there and it's building up as the person's watching TV and leading to a higher likelihood of that prediction error we talked about. So the remedy here, of course, is to try to work through some of that stress. Try to work through some of those reactions that you're automatically having. Try to avoid less when it comes to emotional and stress-related things. Now, avoidance isn't always bad. There are lots of times when being distracted and avoiding things is perfectly fine, but when it becomes a pattern that is just trying to put the lid on a huge pot of stress, it's going to lead in an overflow of stress and symptoms. And then number 3, if neither of those two applies to you, that's when I start to look into people's childhoods or backgrounds a little bit more. When someone has a hyper alert nervous system, it's often because that person has had a long history of other stress and other difficulties. And this is not just referring to those of you who've had traumatic experiences. But once your nervous system gets into this groove of being hyper alert all the time, it sometimes takes reprocessing these past experiences to get your brain out of danger mode and get it to stop producing symptoms in response to visual stimuli. I hope this was helpful for you, and if you have questions or comments, please drop them below. I know this is a paradigm shift from the idea of endlessly doing exercises, but this is actually what I work on with my clients. So I hope my techniques help you. If you enjoyed this video, please like, please share, please subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.